A strange beginning. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in June 2020, the kind of morning where birds chirped lazily and the air smelled fresh from last night's storm. Michael Carson, a retired electrician in his 60s, stood in his backyard with a shovel in hand. His modest single-story home in the suburbs of Ohio had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could enjoy his retirement, tend to his small vegetable garden, and occasionally fix things around the house when enthusiasm struck him. Today was one of those days. Michael had decided to plant a magnolia tree, a birthday gift from his daughter Lisa. "A little splash of color back here wouldn't hurt," she had said, insisting he liven up the otherwise bare backyard. He had chuckled in agreement and scheduled the planting for the following week. As he rolled up his sleeves and started digging near the edge of the yard, not far from the garage, he noticed the soil beneath his shovel felt unexpectedly compact. Michael muttered to himself, "Well, they sure packed this ground like concrete," as he bent down to inspect. The more he dug, the more stubborn the earth became until his shovel hit against something metallic with a sharp clink. Startled, Michael paused, his brow furrowing in curiosity. He struck it again, and the metallic sound confirmed it wasn't just a rock. His mind raced with possibilities, an old pipe perhaps, maybe some long-forgotten piece of farm equipment buried years before his family purchased the property. Curiosity got the better of him, and he knelt down to brush away surrounding dirt. Slowly, a small, rusted box began to reveal itself. It was rectangular, about the size of a bread loaf, and surprisingly intact despite its age. Michael's heart beat a little faster, not from exertion, but from intrigue. "What in the world?" he said aloud. He couldn't help but wonder if he had stumbled upon a time capsule or some secret left behind by the previous owners. Perhaps this was nothing more than an amateur treasure hunt item. "Lisa's gonna get a kick out of this," he chuckled, imagining telling his family later. But as he pried open the lid with the screwdriver fetched hastily from the garage, the humorous thoughts quickly faded. Inside the box was a random assortment of odd objects, fragments of what appeared to be a broken jewelry piece, a bundle of fabric badly deteriorated over time, and underneath it all pieces of what at first glance he assumed were animal bones. Carson squinted, holding a piece up to the sunlight. "What the?" A chill ran over him. These didn't look like animal bones, at least not like any he was familiar with. They appeared too human. His pulse quickened now for a very different reason. Was this someone's morbid prank, or something much worse? He stood up abruptly, his hands shaking slightly, the box still open beside him. He decided it was no laughing matter. Reaching for his cell phone on the patio table, Michael dialed 911. "Hi, yeah, I'm Michael Carson. I live at 1435 Magnolia Lane. Listen, I think I've found something strange. Really strange. You need to come take a look." His voice was steady, but his palms were slick with sweat. A calm dispatcher assured him help was on the way, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet suburban life had just been catapulted into something far darker than he could comprehend. As he waited for the police to arrive, Michael couldn't help but glance over to the box of unearthed items sitting ominously in the dirt. He would later tell his friends, "I had no idea digging that hole would lead to unraveling a decades-old mystery." Little did he know, this single moment, set against the backdrop of his serene backyard, was the beginning of a chilling story no one in their neighborhood would soon forget. The police step in to investigate. "Mr. Carson, you said you found what exactly?" Officer Daniels, a seasoned cop in his late 40s, leaned slightly forward, his notebook in hand. His partner, Officer Mayer, a younger officer fresh out of the academy, stood nearby, glancing curiously at the rusted box partially dug up in the Carson backyard. Michael Carson, fidgeting slightly, rubbed his hands on his jeans, his nerves evident. "Bones," he finally said, his voice firm but uneasy. "Human bones. I mean, at least I think so. They sure don't look like they belong to a raccoon or a dog." His eyes darted to the box that he had found only a few hours ago, now sitting ominously on the small patio table. Officer Daniels nodded, scribbling something in his notebook. "And you were digging here for a tree? Is that right?" "Yeah, just a magnolia tree, you know," Michael replied, pointing toward the dug-up hole near the garage. "Lisa, she's my daughter, brought it as a gift. I never expected to dig up something like that." Mayer stepped closer to the box, adjusting her gloves before cautiously peering inside. Her breath hitched slightly as she studied the contents. A few brittle bone fragments, the deteriorated fabric, and what looked like a piece of jewelry with faded stones that had long lost any sparkle. "This doesn't look random," Mayer murmured, her voice betraying a mix of unease and curiosity. "The way these bones are placed, it seems deliberate to me." Daniels glanced her way but said nothing immediately. He had been on the force long enough to know when evidence pointed to something deeper than coincidence. He turned to Carson once more. "Did you ever notice anything unusual in this yard before today, Mr. Carson? I mean, you've lived here long enough to maybe feel if something was off?" Michael shook his head quickly, almost defensively. "No, never. It's quiet around here. This neighborhood, it's one of those places where the scariest things are raccoons knocking over the trash cans." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to search his memory. "The only odd thing, I guess, this patch of ground where I was digging, it's always felt harder whenever I worked around here, but I thought maybe it was just clay or rocks." Daniels jotted some more notes, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "And the previous owners? Have you ever met them, talked to them about the house's history?" "No, never," Michael admitted. "But the family we bought it from, the Bartons, I think, didn't seem to live here long either. They said they were just flipping the house. Always felt kinda odd, you know? Owners before them, no clue who they were." Daniels hummed, scribbling again. "All right, we'll need to bring in forensics for this. Mayor, call it in." Mayor nodded and stepped aside, her voice professional as she radioed in backup. "This is Officer Mayor. We need forensics and a legal search team down at 1435 Magnolia Lane. Potential human remains found in the backyard. Have them bring excavation tools and evidence bags." Once the radio went silent, Daniels focused back on Carson. "We'll need you to stay here while we secure the scene. You mentioned picking up some of the bones earlier, right?" Michael nodded hesitantly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I know. I probably shouldn't have touched anything, but..." He paused, glancing at the box again. "I had no idea what the hell I'd found until I saw the bones, then I stopped immediately. I called you guys right after." Daniels gave him a reassuring nod. "You did the right thing calling us, but until we can confirm exactly what we're dealing with, we have to assume this is a crime scene, okay? So just stay here. The forensics team will handle the digging from here on out." It wasn't long before 2 patrol cars and a white van from the coroner's office pulled up in front of Michael's otherwise quiet suburban home. Another officer strung up yellow tape around the yard's perimeter, catching the attention of a handful of curious neighbors in their driveways. "Looks like the whole circus is here now," Michael muttered under his breath, feeling slightly self-conscious. As forensics specialists unloaded their kits and began combing through the dirt around the shallow hole, Mayer and Daniels delved deeper into interviewing Michael. Mayer asked, "Mr. Carson, when you found the box, did you notice any signs that it had been moved recently, maybe disturbed, or did it seem like it had been undisturbed for a long time?" Michael thought for a second. "No, I'd have to say it looked old. The box was so rusted, the hinges barely worked when I tried to open it. And the stuff inside, that fabric or whatever it is, it just crumbled apart when I touched it." Mayer frowned slightly. "Okay, and for the record, did anyone else know you were planning on digging here today? Neighbors? Family?" "Just Lisa," Michael replied, "but she's back in Boston right now. I told her I'd handle this myself." Daniels looked up. "Good to know. And you've never had any contractors or workers digging around back here? No upgrades to the property?" "Nope," Michael said firmly. "This yard is exactly as it was when we got the place." As the medical examiner arrived to inspect the remains, Michael was politely but firmly guided out of the way. Mayer and Daniels convened near the garage, watching as the scene unfolded. "This situation has bad vibes all over it," Mayer said softly. "No one buries something like this unless there's something to hide, and those bones, they're not that old. Someone's hiding something." Daniels crossed his arms, his expression stony. "Well, let's hope the bones and that box have some answers for us, because right now this looks like the start of a very long investigation." Initial forensic results. The room buzzed with quiet activity as detectives leaned over reports and forensics investigators handed over evidence bags one by one. A faint scent of chemicals lingered, drifting on the cool air of the police precinct as Officer Daniels and Officer Mayer reviewed the initial findings from the coroner. The atmosphere was tense but focused. Dr. Evelyn Harris, the county medical examiner, adjusted her gloves as she flipped through her notes. She looked up at Daniels and Mayer, her expression professional but grim. "All right," she began. "Let's break this down." She placed the file on the table and gestured toward the evidence bags resting nearby. "Here's what we know so far. Based on an analysis of the remains retrieved from the Carson property, we're dealing with an incomplete set of human bones, more specifically, portions of a skull, 2 femur fragments, and several smaller bones consistent with a human adult. Gender is likely female." She paused to glance at Daniels. and age at the time of death is estimated to be in her late 20s to early 40s. Mayer leaned in, her brow furrowing. And the timeline? How long has she been there? Dr. Harris sighed, pressing a skeletal diagram flat against the table for everyone to see. I'd estimate she's been buried roughly 20 years, give or take. The bones show significant wear and exposure to moisture in the soil, but the box and fabric remnants actually help preserve parts of the remains better than you might expect. Daniel scribbled rapidly into his notebook. 20 years, he muttered under his breath. That lines up with what Carson said about the previous owners buying the house in 1997. So, it's possible whoever did this buried her before or during their tenure. Dr. Harris nodded but raised a hand. It gets more troubling. The skull we recovered, here. She tapped on a photograph clipped to her report. Daniels and Mayer leaned in. You can see signs of trauma right here. She pointed to a jagged crack running along what was clearly the human skull's left parietal region. This was no accident. The fracture suggests a high-impact blow from a blunt object, something like a hammer or brick. Mayer's face tensed as she exchanged a knowing look with Daniels. So, cause of death might be blunt force trauma? Highly likely, Harris answered. Of course, I'll need to complete further analysis back at the lab to confirm whether this was the primary cause of death, or if there might have been additional injuries. Daniel scratched his head. What about the other evidence in the box? That piece of jewelry, the fabric? That's where things get even more curious, Harris replied, pushing another bagged item across the table. This scrap of fabric appears to be part of a dress or blouse. You can still make out faint traces of floral patterns. Based on the fashion and material, I'd estimate it's from the early 2000s, maybe late 90s. It also has some fragments of dried organic material embedded in it, likely blood, which we'll be testing further. And the jewelry? Mayer asked, already taking notes. Could it help identify who this woman was? It's possible, Harris said, pulling up yet another plastic bag containing a small rusted necklace. The once sparkling gemstones had long since dulled and fallen apart, but its shape was still intact. This piece seems modest, not particularly valuable. A sentimental item perhaps. If we can restore some of its details, it might provide us with something useful, like a name or matching photograph if we're lucky. Daniels leaned back in his chair, pressing a hand to his temple. So, we've got bones showing signs of a violent death, clothing that places this at least 2 decades ago, and maybe a piece of jewelry that could help us ID her. Tell me we have something on dental records or DNA. Dr. Harris turned a page in her report. That's our best shot right now. The good news is the skull still has partial dentition. Teeth, intact enough for us to extract DNA samples. There's even a chance we can match this to missing persons reports from that time frame. It'll take a few days though. The samples will need to be cross-referenced with both the state and national DNA databases. Mayer shifted in her seat, her curiosity giving way to impatience. Anything at all to suggest who this could have been? Any hints? What she looked like, her background, anything at all? Harris shook her head. Not yet. We're starting from square one. Depending on the DNA results and cross-referenced dental records, we'll need to build an ID from scratch. Daniels tilted his chair forward, resting his forearms on the table. If we're right about the timeline, this lines up too perfectly with the Millers, the previous owners. We may need to figure out what they were doing around the year 2000. Harris nodded lightly but added, You'd do well to keep an open mind. While it's tempting to zero in on the Millers, this box could have been buried after they left, or even before they moved in. We don't know yet how many hands this property passed through, and jumping to conclusions risks leaving critical stones unturned. Mayer let out a deep breath. So, what's the next move? Dr. Harris closed the file and folded her hands. I'll get the detailed lab reports processed as fast as I can. In the meantime, you should see what you can dig up, no pun intended, about the prior ownership history of the house and anyone connected to it. Also, if there are rumors, stray records, or unusual events around when she was likely buried, now's the time to chase them down. Daniel stood up, anxiety flashing briefly in his face before he smoothed it over with his usual calm demeanor. All right, time to knock on some doors. Thanks, Dr. Harris, keep us looped in. Of course, Harris said, already refocusing on her paperwork as the officers walked off. Daniels turned to Mayer as they headed for the precinct hallway. 20 years, he murmured, almost to himself. Whoever did this either thinks they got away with it or they're long gone. We're going to have to dig deep, Mayer. Mayer gave him a wry smile as they neared their desks. No pun intended? Daniel smirked but quickly returned to a serious tone. Well, let's find out if this woman's killer left behind anything else. Let's unravel this thing, one step at a time. The house's history is investigated. Detectives Daniels and Mayer sat in their unmarked police car, parked a few houses down from 1435 Magnolia Lane. Daniels drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, watching a group of neighborhood kids ride bikes down the quiet street. "I've got to admit," Meyer said, scrolling through her tablet, "this house must have some kind of history if bones were buried in the backyard. People don't just forget about something like that." Daniels nodded, his gaze still fixed on the house. "Yeah, but it's a question of who knew what and when. Time to dig into the property records. My bet is, there's a name somewhere in this paper trail that'll lead us straight to the truth or straight to more questions." Half an hour later, back at the department, they were sitting across from a county clerk named Sharon, whose desk was piled high with manila folders. 1435 Magnolia Lane, Daniels repeated, leaning forward slightly. "We need everything you've got on it. Ownership records, permits, any complaints or violations. Basically, if it's connected to that address, we need to see it." Sharon squinted at the computer screen, typing slowly. "Okay, let me pull that up for you. Magnolia Lane? Yep, here it is. You're in luck. The records go back further than most properties. We still have physical files stored in our archive." She shot Daniels a look. "It's been owned by quite a few people over the years, though. You're gonna have a bit of a trail to follow." "More like a rabbit hole," Mayer muttered under her breath, earning a quick smirk from Daniels as they both leaned closer to watch Sharon work. "All right," Sharon continued, glancing at the screen while reaching for a folder on the edge of her desk. "Looks like the house was first built in 1995 by a local construction company, sold a couple of years later. The first real recorded owners were Thomas and Rebecca Miller. They bought it in 1997. They stayed there a while. Let me see. 2004. That's when they sold it. After that, the house bounced a bit. Looks like 3 different owners until the current resident, Michael Carson, bought it in 2018. Daniels tapped his pen on the laminate desk. "Thomas and Rebecca Miller, what do you have on them?" Sharon flipped open the folder and scanned the pages. "Well, they stayed on the property the longest, 7 years. No major renovations or additions during that time, at least nothing officially filed. But here's something interesting. Around 2000, Rebecca filed a complaint against Thomas for domestic disturbances. It doesn't elaborate much here, but I can flag the incident report for you." Mayer perked up. "A domestic disturbance complaint? Is there anything about a follow-up? Did it escalate?" Sharon frowned at the screen. "It's hard to tell from this. The complaint's classified under resolved, but there's no specific outcome listed. They didn't file for divorce during those years, if that's what you're wondering." Daniels leaned back, his gut instinct beginning to stir. "So she files a complaint, but they stay together for 4 more years?" "Yep," Sharon confirmed. "But here's something else. In 2004, when they sold the house, Thomas was the only one who handled the transaction. There's no mention of Rebecca's name on the deed after that." Mayer shot Daniels a look. "That's odd, right? If they were both owners, why wouldn't she sign off on the sale?" Daniels rubbed his chin, clearly thinking the same thing. "Sharon, can you dig a little deeper on Rebecca? Did she disappear from the county records after 2004, or is there anything about her leaving town?" Sharon typed again, her face scrunching up in concentration. "Give me a second. Okay, last known address shows up as 1435 Magnolia Lane, but there's nothing after that. No driver's license renewals, no voter registration, no tax filings. Nothing, it's like she just vanished." Mayer exhaled sharply. "Vanished. That's never a good sign." "Anything else in the file about the Millers?" Daniels pressed. "Any police reports or anything someone might have just forgotten to mention?" Sharon shook her head. "Nothing stands out apart from that domestic complaint. But here's the kicker. Since you're asking about her disappearance, there's a handwritten affidavit signed by Thomas, claiming Rebecca left voluntarily and, quote, was pursuing a new life in another state. That's the last direct mention of her." Mayer crossed her arms. "Let me guess. He didn't have any proof that she left?" Sharon shrugged, flipping back through the file. "Not that I can see, it was all Thomas's word." Daniel stood abruptly, closing his notebook with a snap. "All right, looks like we've got enough to go on for the Millers. What about after they left? The other owners, it was just house flippers, right?" Sharon nodded slowly, pushing the folder over. "Yeah, the records don't suggest any of them stayed long. The next owners, the Bartons, only kept it for 2 years. They did some minor repairs, probably to resell it. Then another couple, McNally's, stayed for 3, and now the Carsons. None of them seem to have filed any complaints or pulled permits to dig up the yard. If something was buried back then, no one's touched it." Daniel slid the folder toward Mayer. "Great, we'll take this. Can you email us that incident report from Rebecca's complaint? Sure thing. Sharon adjusted her glasses and started typing. But hey, if I were you, I'd look closely at that affidavit from Thomas Miller. Something about this whole situation smells funny. Trust me, Daniels replied, standing up and offering a wry smile. We're already knee-deep in the stink. As they walked back to the car, Meyer broke the silence. Let me guess. Next stop is Miller's last known address? Daniels nodded grimly. Yeah. If Rebecca vanished and that affidavit doesn't hold up under scrutiny, we might be looking at our prime suspect. Clues from former neighbors. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across 1435 Magnolia Lane, as detectives Daniels and Mayer knocked on the door of an old white clapboard house 2 doors down. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly a mix of retirees and young families, but there was one name that popped up during the initial canvass, a longtime resident, Mrs. Edna Holloway. She had lived on the street for over 3 decades, and, if anyone would remember the Millers' time in the neighborhood, it would be her. The door creaked open to reveal a petite woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and her hair pulled into a tight bun. "Detectives?" she asked, glancing curiously at their badges as they introduced themselves. "What can I help you with?" Daniel stepped forward, his notebook already in hand. "Thank you for speaking with us, Mrs. Holloway. We're investigating the discovery of some human remains found 2 houses down, 1435 Magnolia Lane. We understand you've lived here a long time?" "Oh yes," she said, motioning for them to step inside her meticulously clean living room. "I've been here since 1985. I've seen a lot of people come and go from that house. Who are the bones supposed to belong to?" She tilted her head, her tone skeptical but intrigued. "Still working on that," Meyer replied with a slight shrug. "But we're currently looking into the history of the property, focusing on previous owners, specifically Thomas and Rebecca Miller, who lived there from 1997 to 2004. Do you remember them?" Edna frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line as she sat down on her floral-patterned couch. "Oh, I do. They weren't the friendliest couple, that's for sure. Kept to themselves most of the time. Rebecca was nice enough when I'd see her at the mailbox or walking past with their dog, but Thomas?" She paused, shaking her head. "I never liked him." Daniels leaned forward slightly. "What made you say that?" "Well," she hesitated, as if mentally debating how much to say. "These walls talk, detective. You lived near them long enough you'd hear the fights. Shouting late at night, things breaking. I mean, I wasn't the nosy type, but it was hard to ignore. Everyone on the block knew there was trouble in that house." Mayer made a note before asking, "And this was mostly between Thomas and Rebecca?" "Oh yes," Edna confirmed, nodding gravely. "She was a sweet girl, but you could see it on her face. Toward the end, she just seemed so sad, like she was carrying the weight of the world. I'd try to say hello, you know, ask how she was doing, but she'd wave and keep walking head down like she didn't want to be seen." Daniels tapped his pen on his notebook thoughtfully. "Toward the end? What exactly do you mean by that?" "Well, it must have been 2000, maybe 2001, when she just stopped coming around. No more walks with the dog, no more chatting at the mailbox." Edna frowned, leaning forward now, suddenly animated. "I remember asking Thomas once where Rebecca was. It was one morning and he was out front washing his car. I'll never forget the look he gave me, like I'd stepped out of line just by asking. He said she'd gone to Florida to start fresh." Mayer raised an eyebrow. "To start fresh? Did he ever mention details, like where exactly she went?" "Nope," Edna replied curtly. "He just said she needed space and left it at that, but something about the way he said it—" She trailed off, her fingers fidgeting with the lace doily on the armrest of her chair. "I could tell he was hiding something. And then, not too long after, the dog was gone too." "The dog?" Meyer asked, sitting up straighter. "What happened to it?" "He said he gave it away to a friend," Edna said dryly. "But I'm telling you, detectives, that man didn't have friends. Not that we ever saw. He wasn't the type to chat with the neighbors or invite anyone over. What's more, after Rebecca disappeared, he started acting, I don't know, peculiar. Kept to himself more than usual, avoided eye contact. And I remember seeing him in the backyard one night, digging." Daniels exchanged a glance with Mayer, his jaw tightening. "Digging? Do you remember when this was?" Edna squinted, seemingly searching her memory. "It was late, around midnight maybe. I happened to be up, and from my bedroom window you can see part of their backyard through the trees. He was out there with a flashlight and a shovel. Now I'm not one to go making wild accusations, but—" She drew in a long breath. "It struck me as odd, you know. Why would someone be digging at that hour unless they had something to hide?" Daniel scribbled notes furiously while Mayer stayed laser-focused on Edna. Was this near the garage where the box was found? Mayer prodded. Yes, right by the garage, Edna confirmed, her voice sinking to a whisper. The next day, the ground looked freshly turned, but it had this odd patch over it. You know, like someone had been trying to pack it down or cover it with something. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was just landscaping. But now? She shook her head. Dear God. You think she was under there all this time? We're not ruling anything out, Daniel said carefully, his voice tempered with calm professionalism, though his mind was racing. Do you remember any police involvement back then? Did anyone call to report anything suspicious? No, Edna replied regretfully. I guess we all just sort of minded our own business. Truth is, no one wanted to get involved with Thomas. He had a bad temper, detective, and people around here didn't want to end up on the wrong side of it. As Edna wrapped up her recollections, Mayer asked one final question. Do you know if Rebecca had any family? Someone we could speak to who might shed light on her situation at the time? She had a sister, I think, Edna said thoughtfully. I remember Rebecca mentioning her once, lived out west, maybe California. But they weren't close from what I gather. Thomas always seemed to keep her isolated now that I think about it. Daniels closed his notebook and stood, offering Edna a small nod. You've been very helpful, Mrs. Holloway. If you think of anything else, no matter how small, please don't hesitate to let us know. I will, she said, wringing her hands nervously as they walked toward the door. It's just awful, you know, to think something like this could have been right under our noses all these years. As the detective stepped back out into the warm evening air, Mayer looked to Daniels, her face set with determination. That guy's been digging himself into a grave of lies for decades, hasn't he? Daniels slid into the driver's seat, flipping open his notebook before starting the car. If what Edna said checks out, we've got a timeline, a motive, and a pretty damn big red flag with that midnight digging story. Let's see how Thomas Miller explains this one. Response from Thomas Miller. Thomas Miller sat in a small interrogation room at the police precinct, his shoulders hunched forward as though bracing himself under the weight of the questions to come. His thinning gray hair was slicked back, his faded plaid shirt looking a little too big for his wiry frame. He glanced up at the two detectives who stood across the table, his expression equal parts wary and defensive. Detective Daniels leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, while Detective Mayer sat opposite Thomas, her notepad resting on the table, pen in hand. Mr. Miller, Mayer began, her tone polite but firm. We've been looking into the history of 1435 Magnolia Lane. As you know, some human remains were recently found buried in the backyard. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your time living there. Thomas shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. His weathered hands rested flat on the table, his knuckles slightly white. I already heard about that on the news. Crazy stuff, he muttered. But I don't know anything about it, all right? Me and that house, we're ancient history. I haven't lived there in nearly 20 years. Understood, Mayer said, her voice calm. But we're hoping you can help us piece together some details. You purchased the house in 1997 with your wife at the time, Rebecca Miller, correct? Thomas visibly tensed at the mention of his ex-wife, but nodded. Yeah, that's right, but we divorced ages ago. Daniel spoke up now, his tone casual but clearly testing the waters. Actually, Mr. Miller, we've reviewed the records, and there's no court filing or paperwork showing a divorce between you and Rebecca. In fact, we can't seem to find much about her at all after 2000. Thomas blinked, his forehead creasing as though processing what Daniels just said. Well, that's because she left, he said, stammering slightly. Moved to Florida. I told everyone back then. She wanted a fresh start. We'd been arguing a lot. Things weren't good, you know. She said she needed space. Hell, I don't even know where exactly she went. Mayer leaned forward slightly, her pen poised over the notepad. Let me get this straight, Mr. Miller. Your wife suddenly leaves sometime in 2000 and you don't know where she went or make any effort to find her? No follow-up? No contact since? Thomas frowned, clearly annoyed at the thought being laid out so plainly. No, I didn't follow up, he snapped. She said she was done. What was I supposed to do? I respected her wishes. She wanted to disappear and I let her. Daniels raised an eyebrow at this. You just let her disappear just like that? No goodbye to her friends, no goodbye to her family? Thomas shifted again, his fingers drumming the table briefly before stopping. She wasn't exactly close with her family, he said, almost as if rehearsing the line. And look, I didn't want to dig into her private life after she was gone. I figured if she wanted me out of it, I'd stay out of it. Mayer didn't let up. That's interesting because, according to one of your neighbors back then, Rebecca stopped showing up in the neighborhood around 2000. No more walks with her dog, no goodbyes. Do you remember that? What exactly happened that year, Mr. Miller? You sound like you're accusing me of something, Thomas shot back, his tone defensive now. Am I under arrest here? No, you're not, Daniels replied, his tone calm but cutting. But we found a box with human remains buried not far from your old garage. The timeline lines up eerily well with when Rebecca supposedly vanished. You can understand why we have questions. Thomas bit the inside of his cheek, his eyes narrowing. All right, yeah, we argued a lot back then, he admitted finally. But who doesn't? That doesn't mean He paused, swallowing hard as he seemed to choose his next words carefully. That doesn't mean I did anything to her. Rebecca was strong-willed. She handled herself. But you were the last person to see her, Mayer pressed. No one else has seen or heard from her since, not her family, not her friends. And the only explanation is your word that she moved to Florida? Thomas hesitated again. His hands tightened into fists briefly before unclenching. I don't have anything else. That's what happened. She was tired of me, tired of the life we'd built, and she left. End of story. Did she leave with her personal belongings? Clothes, Idaho, money? Daniels asked, tilting his head slightly. Or did she just vanish without a trace? Thomas's lips twitched for a second as if he was about to snap but stopped himself. I helped her pack, all right, he said through gritted teeth. She left with a suitcase full of stuff. That's the last thing I remember. I ain't got nothing else to tell you. Mayer scribbled something in her notepad before flipping to another page. One more thing. We found a handwritten letter sent to Rebecca's family right after she left. Something about it saying she was starting over. Can you confirm that? Thomas blinked, surprised. Then he nodded slowly, perhaps elaborating for the first time without hesitation. Yeah, I wrote it for her, he said quietly. She told me she didn't have the heart to write to them herself, so I did it for her. Tried to explain things for her sake. Family deserved that much. Interesting, Daniel said, watching for his reaction. We're running the letter through handwriting verification. We'll see if that matches Rebecca's handwriting. Or yours. Thomas's face darkened. You're trying to trap me here, he muttered, shaking his head angrily. I already told you. I didn't hurt her. I didn't kill her. I didn't bury anything in that damn yard. If you didn't, then you won't mind answering a few more questions, Daniel said smoothly. Because right now, Mr. Miller, you're the only person who had access to the property and Rebecca before she disappeared. You're barking up the wrong tree, Thomas muttered, crossing his arms. You'll see. I didn't do anything wrong. Daniels and Mayer exchanged a look as they stepped out of the interrogation room to confer. Mayer whispered, He's unraveling, but he's holding on to something. There's more to this than he's admitting. Oh, there's definitely more, Daniels murmured, glancing back toward the door as Thomas sat inside, nervously tapping the table. And we're gonna get it. The fake letter and the elaborate cover-up. The precinct interview room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Detective Daniels sat at one end of the table, fingers laced in front of him, while Detective Mayer leafed through a thick manila folder filled with evidence. Across from them sat Thomas Miller, now looking visibly more tense than in earlier interrogations. His elbows rested on the table, his fingers intermittently tapping as though he were summoning courage, or patience. All right, Mr. Miller, Daniel started, his tone calm but with a sharp undercurrent. Let's get down to it. You mentioned earlier that Rebecca asked you to send a letter to her family after she left. Do you remember what that letter said? Thomas shifted uncomfortably, breaking eye contact. Yeah, I told you, he muttered. She didn't want to deal with them herself. Said it'd be easier if I wrote it for her. I just said what she told me to. Something about starting fresh, moving to Florida, needed space, all of that. He gave a small shrug, feigning nonchalance. I didn't think it was a big deal back then. Mayer tilted her head, watching him carefully. Interesting reasoning, she said quietly, a faint note of challenge in her voice. Mr. Miller, this letter is essentially the last trace of Rebecca anyone's ever had, and we've had it analyzed by a handwriting expert. Thomas froze visibly but tried to brush it off, scoffing. Yeah? And what's that supposed to prove? I already told you, I wrote it for her. Of course it's my handwriting. Right, Mayer replied, her eyes locked on him. She pulled a plastic evidence bag from the folder and slid it across the table toward him. Inside was a photocopy of the letter itself, written neatly on lined paper in dark blue ink. Here it is, she said. The letter from Rebecca. Dated October 2000. Thomas stared at it, unmoving, as though seeing it brought back memories he would rather leave buried. Daniels leaned back in his chair. Here's the thing, Thomas. We had this letter compared against samples of Rebecca's writing, old notes, cards, that sort of thing. Turns out the styles don't even come close to matching. Care to explain why that is?" Thomas's jaw tensed, but after a moment he gave a dry laugh, shaking his head. "I already told you why. She didn't want to write it herself. I did it for her." "Convenient," Daniels replied, his voice hardening slightly. "Here's the problem, though. Rebecca's family, and her sister specifically, didn't just find the letter suspicious because it wasn't her handwriting. They found it suspicious because it wasn't her voice. Apparently Rebecca was never one to talk about fresh starts or needing space. They said she loved Ohio, loved her little life there, no matter the trouble you two were supposedly having." Thomas folded his arms across his chest, his eyes narrowing. "Families don't always know everything," he growled. "People change. Relationships change. I don't see how that's any of your business." "It is our business," Mayer shot back, her voice calm but sharp. "Because we've also been tracking the timeline, and it's not just the letter that doesn't add up. Every piece of this Florida fresh start story you're selling us, it falls apart." "What the hell does that mean?" Thomas spat. His face had darkened, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Daniels flipped open a page in the file and laid it on the table. It was a printed log of activity records. "It means, for starters, we don't see any evidence of Rebecca ever buying a plane ticket, renting a car, or even withdrawing enough cash to leave town. Her bank accounts haven't been touched since 2000. No credit card payments, no new utility registrations, nothing. It's as if she disappeared entirely right after your letter." "Care to explain how that works, Thomas?" Thomas looked like he wanted to respond, but no words came. His lips parted slightly, then closed again as his eyes darted to the folder on the table. Mayer pressed on. "And here's where it gets even stranger. We've spoken to a few of your former neighbors, Mr. Miller. You know what they remember? The fights, the shouting, Rebecca being seen less and less. And then one particularly curious detail, you digging in the backyard late at night, almost exactly when this letter was supposedly written." Thomas's hand twitched against the table. "I was fixing up the yard," he said quickly, too quickly. "I had drainage issues back there." Daniels cocked his head, skepticism written all over his face. "Sure you did. Except we spoke to another expert, call it a hunch, and they said there weren't any drainage permits pulled for your property. Not in 2000, not ever. So if that wasn't about fixing your yard, then exactly what were you digging for?" Thomas slammed his hand on the table suddenly, the sharp noise reverberating in the small room. "You can't do this!" he snapped. "I already told you, I didn't kill Rebecca. She left, that's the end of it." Daniels didn't flinch, his calm tone only adding more weight to his words. "We think you wrote that letter, Thomas. Not for Rebecca, but for yourself. You didn't want her family asking too many questions. You didn't want anyone sniffing around wondering why she vanished. You wanted everything to seem convenient, clean. But here's the thing. The harder you try to make it look clean, the messier it starts to smell." Thomas glared over at him but said nothing. His fists were clenched tightly now, his knuckles white as he sank back in his chair. "That letter wasn't just a kindness to her family, was it?" Mayer asked softly. This time her tone wasn't accusatory, it was almost coldly observational. "It was a cover-up. You didn't send it because that's what Rebecca wanted. You sent it because it's what you needed, to send them away, to keep them from prying." Thomas's jaw worked furiously, as if he were biting back words he didn't know how to say. After a long, taut silence, he finally muttered, "You don't know what you're talking about." "We'll see about that," Daniel said, standing and gesturing toward the evidence bag. "Between the handwriting analysis, bank records, and that freshly dug spot in your backyard, something tells me we're going to find out the real truth about Rebecca and that letter soon." The detectives left the room, leaving Thomas sweating under the fluorescent light. Mayer glanced at Daniels as they made their way down the hall. "You think he's going to crack?" she asked. Daniels' expression hardened. "It's not a matter of if," he said quietly, closing the folder as he walked. "It's a matter of when. And when he does, that letter of his is going to be the noose he tied himself with 20 years ago." Evidence from the backyard. The late afternoon sun bathed the suburban home at 1435 Magnolia Lane in fading golden light as the forensics team worked methodically in the backyard. Yellow police tape flapped gently in the breeze, sectioning off the area near the garage where Michael Carson had first unearthed the box. A small, freshly dug pit marked the spot where the box containing human remains had been unearthed just days earlier. Now, with shovels, precision tools, and radar equipment, the scene resembled something between an excavation site and a crime lab. Detectives Daniels and Mayer stood off to the side with Dr. Evelyn Harris, the county medical examiner, who had returned on site once the second phase of the dig began. Clad in gloves and protective gear, Harris squinted down at a clipboard while updating her notes. "Well," Daniels said, stuffing his hands in his jacket pockets and glancing at the growing pile of evidence bags. "Tell me you've got something, Doc. We need a break here." Harris nodded slowly, flipping her clipboard closed. "I think you're about to get one. There's more here than just those skeletal remains. Much more." Mayer perked up, pulling out her notepad. "What do you mean, like additional bones?" "Not yet," Harris replied, lowering her voice as if recognizing the gravity of her next statement. "But what we have found deepens the mystery. First, there are clear signs that the ground near the garage was deliberately disturbed more than once. A shallow layer of compact soil over loose earth. It's what we call staged compaction. Someone didn't just dig and bury once, this was maintained, likely over a period of months or even years." Daniels frowned. "Maintained? Why, were they worried about something being found?" "That would be my guess," Harris continued. "But here's the twist. My team uncovered fragments of concrete down there. It looked like at some point a section of the garage foundation may have been partially demolished and repoured. It's sloppy work, but deliberately done. Whoever did this wanted to ensure something stayed buried." Mayer whistled low. "Jesus, so it wasn't just a quick bury it and leave it situation. This was premeditated, layered." Harris nodded. "Absolutely. What's more, scattered among the soil were disintegrated traces of plastic sheeting, consistent with someone attempting to seal an area from moisture or decay." She gestured toward one of the forensics team members, who handed her a bag labeled concrete fragments. "Take a look." Daniels leaned forward as Harris held the bag out. Inside it were chunks of aged concrete with flecks of dried dark brown embedded in them. Daniels' eyes narrowed as he muttered, "Is that—" "Blood," confirmed Harris. "Or rather, what's left of blood. My initial tests show these fragments absorbed organic material, likely a splatter or smear that settled into the mix before the concrete hardened." Mayer froze for a second, then exhaled sharply, tapping her pen against her notepad. "So, we've got blood in the concrete and someone burying bones under the compacted earth, and they thought they were being clever covering it up with fresh cement?" "Exactly," said Harris solemnly. "And there's more. We found small fragments of textile fibers embedded in surrounding soil near the box, blue and floral patterned, similar to the ones recovered inside the box with the skeletal remains. It matches the description of what Rebecca Miller's family said she was last wearing." Daniels leaned against the garage, his expression stony. "This was meticulous. Someone went out of their way to make sure that no one stumbled across this. The cement, the plastic, the layers of soil, they weren't being careless. This was about erasing something, or someone." As if on cue, a member of the forensics team called out from across the yard, "Detective Daniels, Detective Mayer, you're going to want to see this!" The two walked briskly toward the techs, Harris close behind them. Kneeling near a secondary patch of disturbed earth was a forensic tech holding up a rusted, long-handled object smeared with clumped dirt. "What is it?" Mayer asked, crouching to get a closer look. The tech turned it slightly, revealing a jagged edge on one end. "Looks like an old garden spade, but here's where it gets interesting." He pointed toward the handle with his gloved hand. "There's dried organic material on this thing, too. Could be blood. We'll have it tested." Daniels crouched lower, narrowing his eyes. "A spade, huh? Any signs of blunt force trauma on the remains we pulled out of the box?" Harris, standing behind him, appeared grim. "Most definitely. The skull trauma suggests a high-impact curved edge consistent with the sharp curvature of a tool like this. If the blood on that spade matches the blood in the box, well, it paints a pretty clear picture, doesn't it?" Mayer clenched her jaw. "So whoever buried her didn't just bury the weapon, they buried evidence right next to her. You think they thought it would all deteriorate over time? Concrete, soil, and all?" Harris adjusted her glasses before answering. "That seems likely. But time has a funny way of preserving certain things, especially when someone thinks they've properly concealed them. No matter how much they tried, they couldn't stop microorganisms, trace chemicals, and degradation patterns from leaving hints. If this was meant to stay buried forever, they underestimated the evidence." Daniel stood again, the wheels turning in his head. "All right, we've got the box, bones, fibers, blood-stained concrete, and now what could be the murder weapon? Anything else?" The forensics tech gestured toward a small bag being sealed nearby. "Found this next to the spade. Looks like a wallet or purse. Could have belonged to the victim. It's pretty degraded, but there are faint remnants of identification inside. We're cataloging it and we'll bring it in for preservation." Harris chimed in, her voice low but intense. If any part of that ID is readable and it confirms it belonged to Rebecca Miller, you'll have even further proof of what we're dealing with. Either way, all signs are pointing straight to this backyard being a very deliberate, very personal burial site designed to stay hidden. Daniels nodded slowly, a chill creeping over him despite the warm air. He turned to Mayer, his tone serious. Blood, evidence of trauma, personal belongings buried alongside her. This wasn't just about covering up a death. This was someone trying to erase a person from existence entirely. Mayer caught her partner's gaze and nodded in solidarity, though her voice betrayed her unease. And I think we know who. Just need to show the son of a bitch the pile of lies he built over 2 decades and watch him crumble. As the sun dipped lower into the sky, casting long shadows over the now empty backyard, Daniels turned toward the garage one last time, imagining the years of secrets buried beneath. With the evidence mounting, the past couldn't stay hidden much longer. Conflicting testimony. Thomas Miller sat stiffly in the interrogation room for his second round of questioning, his arms crossed and his expression dark. The air in the room felt heavy, despite the low hum of the air conditioner above, and the walls, painted an uninviting dull gray, seemed to close in. Across the table sat Detectives Daniels and Mayer, the former leaning back in his chair, his arms relaxed, but his eyes sharp and unforgiving. Mayer flipped through her notepad, her pen scratching notes she was already prepared to challenge. "Let's go over this again, Mr. Miller," Daniels began, his voice steady but laced with control. "You said earlier that Rebecca, your wife at the time, left on her own in late 2000. You said she packed a bag and you helped her leave, correct?" "Yeah, that's what I said," Thomas replied, his tone clipped and defensive. He shifted slightly in his chair, looking anywhere but at the detectives. "How many times do I need to go over this?" "As many times as it takes for your story to make sense," Mayer said coolly, not looking up as she flipped to another page in her notepad. "Because right now, Mr. Miller, not a lot of it adds up." Thomas clenched his jaw and ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. "I'm telling you exactly what happened. She left. End of story. There's nothing for me to add that I haven't already said." Daniel straightened in his chair, his relaxed demeanor fading slightly. "Here's the thing, Thomas. Every time we talk to you, little details in your story seem to change. For example," he said, glancing at his own notes, "the first time you spoke with us, you said Rebecca left at the beginning of October. Then, in your next statement, you said it was closer to the end of October." "It was 20 years ago," Thomas snapped, his voice rising slightly. "Pardon me if I don't remember the exact date off the top of my head." Mayer raised an eyebrow, scribbling something down in her notebook. "Fair," she replied calmly. "But for something as significant as your wife walking out on you after years of marriage, you'd think the date might stick a little better, no?" Thomas glared at her but said nothing, his lips pulling tight into a thin line. "And then there's the part about how she left," Daniels continued, stepping smoothly into the opening Mayer had created. "In our first conversation you told us Rebecca left without saying goodbye to anyone, but a couple of hours later you suddenly remembered she wrote letters to her family. Now, you say you wrote those letters for her because she didn't feel like doing it herself. Which is it?" "It's both," Thomas said through gritted teeth, slamming his hands on the table. "She told me what to write and I wrote it for her. Is that so hard to understand?" "No," Daniel said, lowering his voice to a calm but more unsettling tone. "What's hard to understand is why you didn't mention that in the first place. See, when people tell the truth, they don't keep adding details after the fact. This feels like a story you're trying to patch together, Thomas." "I'm not patching together anything!" he barked, leaning forward. His face flushed red as his voice cracked slightly. "You dragged me in here, you're treating me like a damn criminal, and for what? Because my ex-wife decided she couldn't deal with me anymore and disappeared?" Mayer placed her pen down, locking eyes with Thomas. "We're treating you like a criminal, as you put it, because we found human remains buried in your old backyard, Thomas. And as far as we can tell, those remains fit the timeline of Rebecca's disappearance a little too neatly. Do you want us to believe that's a coincidence?" Thomas scoffed and shook his head, but the slight tremor in his hands wasn't lost on either detective. "I didn't put anything in that yard. If bones are there, I don't know how they got there." "Interesting," Daniel said, his eyes narrowing. "Because one of your old neighbors seemed to remember you digging in that yard late at night around the time Rebecca disappeared. Flashlight, shovel, ring a bell?" Thomas paused, his mouth opening as if to counter the claim, but no words came out. He eventually leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively. "Yeah, I dug back there," he muttered. "I told you already I was fixing a drainage problem." "Let's talk about that drain again," Mayer cut in, her tone soft but sharp enough to cut through his excuses. You said earlier it was near the garage, but when we asked the county clerk about any permits pulled for your address, you know what she said? That there were none. Not for drainage issues, not for anything. So why lie about that? It wasn't something I needed a permit for, Thomas growled. It was something simple I could handle myself. Uh-huh, Daniel said, unconvinced. And this drainage problem, does it have anything to do with why the soil layers back there were carefully packed down and disturbed multiple times in the years before you moved? Thomas's eyes flickered briefly, betraying a crack in his composure. I don't know what you're talking about. No? Daniels pressed, leaning forward now and placing his palms flat against the cold metal table. Because I think you're forgetting something very important, Thomas. The evidence doesn't lie. That concrete foundation back there wasn't torn up on its own. And those bloodstains we found embedded in it, yeah, they're very real, so tell me, he said, his voice taking on a deadly calm. How does a busted garage floor tie into your innocent little home improvement project? Thomas shook his head frantically, his confidence starting to crumble. I don't know about blood. There was a crack in the floor. I had to patch it up. That ground, it gets wet. It shifts over time. Wet ground doesn't bleed, Mr. Miller, Mayer interrupted coolly. And the blood wasn't just on the floor, it was in the concrete chunks we pulled, as if it had seeped into the mix when it was poured. While we're at it, we also found fabric fibers in the dirt. Fibers consistent with what Rebecca's family described her wearing the day she left. Care to explain that too? Thomas stared at her, his breathing heavy. I didn't kill her, he muttered, his voice bordering on a whisper. I didn't. Then help us understand the truth, Daniel shot back. Because the more you dodge, the more guilty you look. You're not a very good liar, Thomas. Your story keeps changing, getting fuzzier every time we talk to you. The inconsistencies pile up and sooner or later this whole thing is going to collapse. Gritting his teeth, Thomas sat in silence, his fists clenched on the table. He looked like a man cornered, mentally scrambling. Mayer let the silence hang for a moment before standing and gathering her notes. Think hard, Thomas, she said as she stood. You've got one chance to get on the right side of this investigation, because if you keep stalling, the evidence is going to finish this conversation for you. Daniel stood as well, glancing at Mayer before throwing a final remark over his shoulder as they headed for the door. We've got more digging to do, literally and figuratively. Let us know if you want to stop wasting our time. As they left the room, Daniels turned to Mayer. He's tangled up in his own lies and it's starting to show. Yeah, she muttered, her voice low. But he's not ready to say it yet. Pressure's building though, he's gonna break, it's just a matter of time. The shocking confession. Thomas Miller sat slumped in the interrogation room, the weight of the last few hours pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. His once defiant demeanor had cracked, replaced by an exhaustion that seemed to have aged him 10 years in the span of one day. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead as he stared at the table, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the air conditioning. Detectives Daniels and Mayer sat across from him, their postures stiff but their focus razor-sharp. Mayer was flipping through her notepad, her pen poised, while Daniels leaned forward, his elbows resting on the cold metal table. He broke the silence with a low, controlled voice. Thomas, Daniels began, his tone steady but firm, you've been dodging us for hours now, changing your story, leaving out details, denying facts that we both know you can't explain away, but let's be real. You know as well as we do that this is the end of the line. Thomas didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the table, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Mayer stepped in, her voice softer, but no less intimidating. The evidence isn't going away, Thomas. The blood on the concrete, the fibers in the dirt, the weapon buried right there in your backyard. It doesn't lie. And neither do the bones we pulled out of that box. You've had 20 years to cover this up, to hide the truth. But it's over now. Thomas finally exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging further. His lips parted as if he were about to speak, but no sound came out. He shifted in his seat, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of the table, knuckles brushing against the cold metal. I didn't mean for it to happen, he muttered, so softly it was almost a whisper. Both detectives froze, their eyes locking for a split second before Daniels leaned in closer. What didn't you mean to happen, Thomas? His tone was calm, measured, but the tension was unmistakable. Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly as he tried to gather himself. It wasn't supposed to end like that. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and threatening. Mayer set her notepad down, her pen quiet for the first time in the hours they'd been in the room. "Thomas, we need you to be specific," she said gently but firmly. "What wasn't supposed to happen? Talk to us." Thomas's breathing quickened, his hands balling into fists on the table. "We were fighting," he finally said, his voice strained and hoarse. It got bad, real bad. We'd been fighting for months by then, you know. She was talking about leaving, about divorce. And I didn't want that. I couldn't let her just walk away like that, after everything we'd been through." Daniels leaned in even closer now, his elbows firmly planted on the table. "What happened during the fight, Thomas?" "I don't even remember what started it," Thomas admitted, his voice trembling. "Something stupid probably, it always was. She said something and I yelled back, and before I knew it we were screaming at each other. She said she was done, that she was leaving, going to her sister's or something. Then she grabbed the suitcase." He paused, his throat constricting as though the words physically hurt to say. His breathing was shaky now, and beads of sweat trickled down his temples. "And then what, Thomas?" Daniels pressed softly, his voice steady but intense. Thomas's eyes were wide now, glistening as if tears were threatening to fall. She turned to walk out the door. She had her back to me and I was so angry. I grabbed her arm to stop her, to make her listen, but she pulled away. Then she lost her balance. I wasn't thinking, His voice cracked, and he licked his dry lips, trying to catch a breath before continuing. "She fell," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She hit her head on the edge of the table. There was so much blood. He broke off, his entire body trembling now. Daniels and Mayer exchanged a tense look, both remaining silent to let the confession unfold. "I panicked," Thomas blurted, his voice cracking as he finally raised his eyes to meet Daniels's. They were bloodshot, hollow, a man drowning in his own guilt. "I didn't know what to do. She wasn't breathing and there was blood everywhere. I kept telling myself it was an accident, that it wasn't my fault, but I knew no one would believe me." "So you decided to hide it," Mayer said quietly, her voice tinged with just enough edge to cut through the tension. "You decided to bury the truth with her." Thomas nodded slowly, his lips quivering as he spoke. "I wrapped her in that blue dress she was wearing. I don't know why, maybe because it felt wrong to do it any other way. I put her in that box from the garage. The old garden spade was sitting right there next to it. I don't even know how I got through it. The digging, the packing, everything. I wasn't thinking. It was like it wasn't even real." His voice broke completely now as tears finally spilled over his cheeks. Daniel sat back, his face stern but calm, letting the man cry for a moment before probing further. "You didn't stop there, did you?" Daniels asked quietly. "After you buried her?" Thomas shook his head, sobbing openly now. I covered it with dirt, but it didn't feel like enough. I worried someone would find her. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced the cops were digging up the yard right then. So I poured concrete over it later, told myself it would keep her safe, that it would keep everything quiet." "And the letter?" Mayer asked, her voice calm but fierce. "The one you sent her family?" Thomas nodded again, wiping at his face with shaking hands. "I wrote it, made it sound like she'd left for Florida. I just needed them to believe she was okay, that she'd moved on. Maybe if they believed it, I could believe it too. But every night I see her face, every time I close my eyes." The room was silent for a long moment, save for Thomas's ragged breathing and quiet sobs. Daniels finally stood, placing the folder on the table. "Well, Thomas," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm, "you're right about one thing. You're never going to get away from this. It's over." Mayer stood as well, her face set with equal parts resolve and disgust. "We'll make sure Rebecca finally rests in peace," she added tightly before both detectives turned and left the room. Inside, Thomas sat alone, his tears falling onto the cold surface of the table as his 20-year lie came crashing down around him. The trial. The courtroom buzzed with low whispers, a steady hum of tension and anticipation as the trial of Thomas Miller began. The gallery was packed, filled with curious onlookers, local reporters scribbling in their notebooks, and Rebecca Miller's family sitting solemnly in the front row. The judge entered, and the room fell silent as everyone stood. A thick oak gavel struck the bench, and the proceedings were officially underway. Thomas Miller sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, his once defiant posture now diminished under the weight of the charges. Dressed in a dark suit that hung awkwardly on his wiry frame, he looked years older. Beside him, his attorney Sheila Carson whispered in his ear, her voice low but firm, trying to steady her client. Across the room, Assistant District Attorney Paul Whitman arranged his files at the prosecution's table, his face set with determination. "All rise," the bailiff called. "Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Marion Prescott presiding." Judge Prescott, a formidable woman in her early 60s with silver hair pinned in a bun and sharp glasses perched high on her nose, surveyed the room with an air of authority. She nodded and gestured for everyone to be seated. "Let's proceed. ADA Whitman, you may give your opening statement." Whitman rose, buttoning his suit jacket as he stepped toward the jury box. He paused for a moment, looking each juror in the eye before beginning. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you will hear a story about betrayal, deception, and ultimately, justice delayed. For 20 years Thomas Miller carried a secret, a dark, terrible secret buried not just in his backyard, but within himself. That secret was Rebecca Miller, a woman who trusted the defendant and paid for that trust with her life." Whitman's voice was calm and measured, but it carried the weight of the evidence behind it. He gestured toward a large display screen set up near the jury box. "Evidence will show that Thomas Miller didn't just accidentally harm his wife during a heated argument, as the defense would have you believe," Whitman continued, his voice rising slightly. "Evidence will prove that after causing her death, he made calculated, deliberate moves to hide his crime. You'll see photos of the concrete slab he poured to cover her remains. You'll hear about the fake letter he wrote, trying to convince her family she had simply left for a fresh start. And you'll hear from forensic experts who will confirm the blood, the fibers, the murder weapon. All of it points directly to the defendant." Whitman turned and pointed subtly toward Thomas. "The man sitting before you orchestrated a cover-up that lasted for 2 decades. But what he couldn't cover up was the truth. And today, that truth will finally come to light." The jury sat in rapt attention, their expressions already drawn taut with intrigue and unease. Whitman returned to his table, calm and confident. The defense attorney, Sheila Carson, stood next, smoothing her skirt before addressing the courtroom. Her voice was softer, almost empathetic, with a tone carefully calibrated to resonate with the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, walking slowly along the edge of the jury box, "my client, Thomas Miller, is a man deeply flawed, yes. He made mistakes in the heat of the moment, mistakes that spiraled beyond his control. But this case isn't about whether or not Mr. Miller panicked. It isn't even about whether or not Rebecca Miller tragically lost her life, which we all agree was a heartbreak no family should endure." She paused, letting her voice lower into a calm, persuasive rhythm. "This case is about intent. The prosecution would have you believe that my client coldly calculated his wife's death, that he acted with malice and criminal premeditation. But the truth, as you'll hear over the course of this trial, is far different. You'll hear Thomas's confession, recorded after hours of intense interrogation, and you'll see that it's the confession of a man racked with guilt, not guilt from murder but guilt from failing to act when his wife fell and hit her head. Thomas made terrible choices after that accident, but his choices were driven by panic, not by the intent to harm." She turned and locked eyes with the jury, her voice soft but pleading. "I ask you to keep an open mind and remember that mistakes and even bad decisions are not murder. At the conclusion of this case, the evidence will show that while Thomas Miller deserves accountability, he does not deserve to be branded as a murderer." Sheila returned to her seat, giving Thomas the briefest reassuring nod. He kept his gaze down, visibly uncomfortable under the weight of every set of eyes in the room. Testimonies shake the room. The trial inched forward over the course of the week. Forensic experts were brought to the stand first. A specialist from the crime lab provided damning testimony, describing how the concrete slab, a focal point of the investigation, contained traces of Rebecca Miller's blood. Whitman's questioning was cutting and precise. "Can you confirm, Dr. Hensley, that this blood did not simply spill accidentally into the concrete mix?" "Yes," Dr. Hensley replied confidently. "The spatter pattern embedded in the concrete suggests that the blood was present on a surface before the concrete was poured. It's consistent with an intentional cover-up." Sheila demonstrated some bite during her cross-examination, however. "Dr. Hensley, would it be fair to say that the blood could have come from an accidental injury occurring near the same location? There's no way to date the blood exactly, correct?" "That's correct," the doctor admitted grudgingly. "It could suggest an accidental event, though highly unlikely given the circumstances." When Rebecca's sister Claire Harris took the stand, tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point. Dressed in a modest black blouse, Claire's voice was steady, but her grief was palpable. "Rebecca was my baby sister. She loved her life, her house, her garden, even her fights with Thomas. She loved this life, and there was no way she would have just left without saying goodbye. The letter we got, it wasn't her. It wasn't her handwriting, and it wasn't her voice. She glared at the defense table, her voice finally cracking. She didn't leave. He took her from us. Thomas shrunk under her words, his shoulders caving inward as if he could disappear altogether. The defendant's turn. Finally, the moment arrived. Thomas Miller was called to the stand. His attorney had advised against it, but deep down Thomas knew there was no avoiding it. Dressed in a suit that still didn't fit quite right, Thomas shuffled up to the witness stand, visibly sweating even before the first question. Whitman stood, his voice sharper than it had been for any other witness. "Mr. Miller, you claim Rebecca's death was an accident. You claim she fell during an argument, that her death was not your fault. But the steps you took afterward, burying her, pouring concrete, writing a fake letter, those don't sound like the actions of someone acting with remorse. They sound like the actions of a man covering up a crime." Thomas swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of the stand as if for balance. "I didn't know what else to do," he stammered. "I was scared. I thought no one would believe it was an accident. I panicked." "That's your excuse for 2 decades of silence?" Whitman pressed, stepping closer. "You poured concrete over your wife's body, wrote a letter pretending she was alive, and you want this jury to believe you panicked? You didn't once think about her family, about what they'd deserve to know?" "I did," Thomas croaked, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "And I've carried that guilt with me every day since, every single day." Mayer, sitting at the prosecution table, didn't flinch as Thomas's words hung in the air. The jury's faces betrayed a mix of anger and pity, both emotions Thomas had clearly resigned himself to receiving. The verdict. After days of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Judge Prescott called the court to order, her face unreadable. "Madam Foreperson," Prescott began, "has the jury reached a unanimous decision?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson said, standing with a folded slip of paper in hand. As the verdict was read, gasps rippled through the courtroom. "Guilty of voluntary manslaughter, guilty of tampering with evidence." Thomas's face fell, his attorney whispering hurried words that he didn't seem to register. Rebecca's family clutched one another, bittersweet relief washing over them. Judge Prescott struck her gavel. "Sentencing to proceed next week. Court is adjourned." And just like that, 20 years of secrets unraveled in a single defining moment. The lasting reminder. The wind carried a solemn stillness across the suburban neighborhood of 1435 Magnolia Lane. On a crisp morning in late fall, the community gathered in a small, humble ceremony at a local cemetery. Rebecca Miller's remains, lost and hidden for 20 years, had finally been laid to rest. The air was sharp and cool, leaves swirling underfoot as if the earth itself acknowledged the gravity of the moment. Among the crowd of mourners was Detective Daniels, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat as he watched the finishing touches on Rebecca's gravestone being revealed. Beside him stood Detective Mayer, her usually sharp tone softened by the quiet reverence the day required. "You'd think after solving a case like this it'd feel like closure, wouldn't you?" Daniels muttered low enough that only Mayer could hear. Mayer didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on Rebecca's family, gathered tightly together near the front row of folding chairs beside the freshly turned earth. Claire Harris, Rebecca's sister, gripped a tissue in one hand and a small framed photograph of Rebecca in the other. Her face had aged not from time but from years of questions, pain, and wondering. "I don't think closure is ever the right word, Daniels," Mayer finally replied, her voice steady, solemn. "Justice, maybe. Peace, if she's lucky, but not closure. You can't close 20 years of grief, not completely." Daniels let out a breath and nodded, looking down at the damp soles of his shoes. "You're probably right about that. Still feels like this whole thing's been hanging in the air, like it wasn't just the Millers' lives he ruined, it rattled through the whole damn neighborhood." Before Mayer could respond, Claire got up and took a few hesitant steps toward the gravestone. Its inscription was simple but beautiful. Rebecca Miller, 1971, 2000. A gentle heart, finally at rest. Claire's voice was shaky but firm as she addressed the small circle of people gathered around. "For the past 20 years my family and I have been stuck in place, stuck in pain. There wasn't a day we didn't wonder where Rebecca was, or why she hadn't come back to us." Daniels and Mayer exchanged a glance, both trying not to let the weight of Claire's words sink too far into their guts. They were detectives, trained professionals used to compartmentalizing their cases, but this time it felt different. Maybe it was the length of time Rebecca had been missing. Maybe it was the callousness of her burial. Maybe it was simply Rebecca's photo staring back at them, a young woman who'd smiled once but never would again. Claire continued, her voice breaking slightly as her eyes shimmered with tears. "I wanted to hate him," she admitted, her words raw and unpolished. "Thomas Miller. There were nights I dreamed of screaming in his face, asking him why he took her, why he'd let us hurt for 20 whole years. But now that we know, it doesn't feel like hate anymore." This caught Daniels off guard, and Meyer raised a curious brow. "What does it feel like?" Meyer murmured under her breath. Claire seemed to hear the question, even if it wasn't meant for her. She exhaled deeply and answered it for herself. "It feels like grief," she said simply. "Just grief, because nothing can bring her back now. Not justice, not this trial, not this gravestone. It helps, knowing the truth, but it doesn't fix the hole she left in all of us." The crowd grew heavy with silence. The wind seemed to pick up, shaking the trees around them in a gentle, almost melancholic rustle. Daniels broke the silence, speaking softly to Meyer as his eyes stayed glued to the family. "You know, it's moments like this that make me question why I got into this job. Dragging bodies out of backyards, interrogating guys for hours on end. Sometimes it makes you feel like all you're doing is scratching at the worst parts of humanity." Meyer turned her head toward him just slightly, her tone now quieter but resolute. "That's exactly why we do it," she said. "Because if we don't, no one else will. It's ugly, yeah. It's hell having to confront what people are capable of, but for families like hers?" She nodded subtly toward Claire. "This is the only way they get answers. Even if it takes decades, it's worth it." Daniel sighed but didn't argue. Maybe he didn't have the energy to, or maybe deep down, he knew Meyer was right. As the ceremony wrapped up, friends and family approached the gravestone one by one, placing small flowers or mementos by the soil. Claire kneeled down, her shaking hand brushing against the cold stone. For a long, quiet moment she simply sat there, her head bowed, lost in her own private memories. Finally she stood and turned to Daniels and Meyer. Her face was worn but carried a faint resilience that hadn't been there before. "I never got the chance to thank you both," Claire said, her voice trembling just enough to make Daniels shift uncomfortably. "For not giving up. For finally finding her." Daniels wished he knew what to say to that. He forced a small smile and nodded. "We just wanted to make sure she could come home." Meyer, always the pragmatist, stepped in quickly. "It's not about us, Claire. You fought for her too, and now she has the dignity she deserved all along." Claire nodded, clutching Rebecca's photo tightly before stepping back to join her family. Daniels and Meyer watched her leave, standing silent as the morning sun filtered through thinning clouds. As the family disappeared into the distance, Daniels finally spoke, breaking the quiet. "You think they'll be okay?" Meyer tilted her head as if weighing the question. "I think they'll learn to live with it. That's all any of us can do, right? Carry it, one way or another." The detectives lingered near the grave for just a moment longer, looking down at the dirt below. The finality of it all, the trial, the truth, the burial, it should have felt satisfying, but it didn't. Not entirely. Walking back toward their car, Daniel suddenly stopped and glanced over his shoulder at the gravestone one last time, a lasting reminder, etched into the ground for all to see. Rebecca Miller's name, her years of life, a story of betrayal and justice that would remain long after the players involved had faded away. "You were right earlier," Daniel said to Meyer as they slid into the vehicle. "This isn't closure, but maybe it's enough." Meyer started the engine, her gaze fixed ahead as she spoke. "Enough for them, enough for her, that's all that matters." And with that, they drove away, leaving behind the quiet cemetery and its gravestones, a symbol not just of loss but also of answers, answers dug up from the ground and from 20 years of silence.